The tributes continue to pour in from across the globe. Dr. Chidi Achebe is the son of world-renowned literary giant, poet, critic, writer. Dr. Achebe is also a physician executive with 25 years experience in healthcare. He's the chairman and CEO of AIDE, an US-based organization dedicated to the development of the African continent. So he joins us now to share his memorable encounters with the late Archbishop Tutu whilst growing up, and of course later on over the years. Chidi, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Condolences to you and your family. And perhaps let's just start off a little bit with when was your first encounter with the Arch, his work in particular, and later on in years when you did get to physically meet him?
Well, I think, thank you first of all, thank you for having me, Sophie. So this is a sad time for all of us across the globe, not just in South Africa, not just in Africa, but across the planet. And we send our condolences to his family. I've been a student of the Archbishop. One of the great privileges of being Chidi Achebe's son is that you get to meet these luminaries. So I will tell you later on about the meeting that my dad had with him in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I was there with my mother. I think this is somebody who inspired not just greatness, but also somebody who set a moral compass for the entire world, who encouraged leaders to do the right thing. Who was a beacon of social justice and a crusader for the vulnerable, and somebody who challenged all of us to be better Christians, Muslims, you name it, and just love one another on earth.
You mentioned a very interesting thing in our conversation about a meeting where the Arch saw your father later on in life. He was in a wheelchair. Just talk to us a little bit more about what transpired.
So the meeting was set up. So I'll go back a bit to 2002. My dad was invited to deliver the Steve Biko lecture, and it was a fantastic affair. With Nkosi Nati, Kolela Manchu, who organized it and invited us. And we went along with him. We met Madiba, Nelson Mandela, Nadine Gordimer, a bunch of luminaries. We were supposed to meet the Archbishop at that time, but for whatever reason, I think he was either out of the country, we didn't. So a couple of years later, a meeting was scheduled. At the time, Dad was at Bard College, and the Archbishop was in Cambridge. And so we journeyed to Massachusetts to meet him. My dad was in a wheelchair towards the end of his life after being disabled in a car accident. And as soon as the Archbishop saw the wheelchair van pull up, he came to the wheelchair, climbed into it, knelt down. You know, this is quite emotional, and prayed for us, prayed for my dad, prayed for the family, and then helped him my father get into the quarters where he was staying as Archbishop for tea. And they had this, glorious conversation about literature and politics and African affairs. It was wonderful.
That special relationship between the Arch, obviously Madiba, whom your father was also very close to, talk to us about that experience, the learnings and teachings, and how they connect and interconnect.
Yes, I think this, I've listened to a lot of tributes across the world about the life of Archbishop Tutu, and I think this is probably a good time to kind of put his work in context, because I don't want to dampen what other people have said. I just don't think we've completely captured his essence. And Madiba and the Archbishop and Achebe and Sisulu, all these people were part of a school of thought. And I'm just going to very quickly run through what I think are the things that I don't want us to ever forget. The political piece, of course, people have talked about his being an anti-apartheid warrior, and was a voice amongst Mandela, Biko, Tambo, Sisulu. His work with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has been mentioned. It's a beautiful thing to remember that he opted for restorative justice over retribution. And we need to make sure we never forget that, or else the future generations will not understand that he helped prevent a bloodbath. On a social level, this is a man who was a crusader for social justice. He advocated for the poor, the sick, the stigmatized, the outcasts of society. He really tried to live a Christ-like life where he advocated for the least amongst us. Related to that, we've talked about civil rights and how he touched on racial discrimination and how he fought for those who were persecuted.
Chidi, just before we get deep into those issues, I do apologize for interrupting you. And we're going to bring up some of the wonderful pictures that you were kind enough to share with us, because I do want us to get into great detail, the Archbishop's work and your thoughts about it. You've written about it, you've shared widely on social media. But just before we get into that, a very important aspect that we must also let people know, those who are either aware or not, the Archbishop was actually heading one of the committees that were set up for the burial of your dad as well.
Absolutely. So, soon after, a few years after the meeting I talked about in Cambridge, my dad passed away. And one of the committees that we set up, an international committee for his burial, was headed by Archbishop Tutu. We reached out to him, and he was very gracious, and he said absolutely he would be the chairperson of that international committee. And it was his presence and the work that he did that really helped the family galvanize a great deal of international support around the death of my dad. There's really, unless you've gone through this, there's nothing more devastating to a family than the death of a parent, right? And I think that the family is deeply grateful, both in a spiritual and deeply, humanitarian level, to Archbishop Tutu and his generosity of spirit. And these are some of the things that, personal things that I wanted to share beyond what we already know about the man.
So let's perhaps just stick with that, the spirituality. Reflect on the fact that not only was he a well-respected theologian, and also who wrote children's books, but you also reflect on his friendship with the Dalai Lama. Of course, much of that has been reflected on. But your own perspective on that, how it's made his life and our lives richer.
Yes, he was a moral conscience, not just of South Africa, but somebody whose voice was heard across the world. He was a beacon of light for this planet of ours. He was somebody who challenged all of us to love each other and to understand that humanity needs to find a way to foster peace on earth. He was against religious bigotry. He was a man who not only preached from the pulpit to politicians, but to all our hearts. Yes, he had this celebrated friendship with Dalai Lama. He wrote a book with him, which is very, very well received, called The Book of Joy. But one thing that people also forget is the fact that these two men were really trying to reach out to all of us to foster love between all races, love between different peoples and religions, so that we can have a very peaceful world where we can improve the lives of those who live in this world. That also included, protecting the climate and the planet and cherishing it as well. So there are many aspects of this man's great spiritual being that I think need to be kind of discussed as well.
As you say, you've been a student of his work, and I want us to juxtapose the political, including the social justice, against the moral conscience, because those don't always live side by side.
No. No, I think that one of the reasons why he's very special is that in being a social justice crusader, he often challenged us to focus on those who, as the Bible tells us, are quote unquote the least amongst us. That if you take care of those who are the least amongst us, you take care of them. That is the charge that Christ had passed along to all of us. So he had his ear to the ground. He had his heart with those who are the most vulnerable. He fought for them. So this is just not somebody who would preach at the pulpit and go away. He was on the streets. He marched. He was an advocate for the needy. And so the political piece is often touted. Yes, he was a voice for the anti-apartheid movement. He worked with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but he also worked with the poor, with the vulnerable, with those who are stigmatized, the outcasts. And he challenged all of us to take care of those as well. So this is a man who's of great complexity. And so it was important to me to kind of, as a student of his work and his life, to begin to make sure that people understood and appreciate the complexity of this man's both greatness, his wisdom, his humanity, his humility, and his compassion for those who are vulnerable in our societies.
Chidi, just picking off from that, I'd like to, and I borrow the term Trinity, go back to this friendship, this association, this collegiality between your father, Chinua Achebe, Nelson Mandela Madiba. We know he himself was outspoken, just like your father. Your father was critical about a lot of things that he saw, not only in the political realm, but also in the social sphere. But so was the Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And somehow just looking at social media and how some people have tried to cancel the good of his work because of that outspokenness, because of that agility and intellectualism and being fast enough to put it out there in the public sphere.
Well, yeah, I think that's very important to highlight. So he was part of a complete school. I call this school the Pan-African intellectual renaissance of the 20th century, that my father, Chinua Achebe, belonged to. But again, Madiba was part of this, and so was he, and many great writers and Ngugi, showing all these men and women, Nadine Gordimer, Kotsi, Cecilu, all these men and women were part of a movement that wanted to tap into the promise of Africa, to make Africa realize its potential. Africa is an incredible continent that has everything that one needs to develop. But we're also very humane people and loving people. And the challenge has been to elect the best kinds of leaders to tap into the potential of Africa and make it, for lack of any other word, a paradise. And so these men, the friendship they had was not just on a level of if you like, the struggle. It was a philosophical and intellectual level, a level where they felt very deeply about the Africanness and what needed to be done to improve the condition of Africans, not just on the continent, across the world, and the global family of all human beings as well. So they share a great deal of, if you like, a spiritual bond, which is, I think, what drew them, very distinctly, but again, very interconnectedly at the same time.
And I'd like to use this phrase that a prophet is often not respected or heard in his or her community. You speak about these men and how much they've written, and I want you to reflect on that. The prescience in your father's book, the trilogy, for instance, which has been leaned on, borrowed on from so many nations and generations, and trying to understand the world that we're in. The Arch himself, being an author of numerous books, believe in God's hands, no future without forgiveness, hope and suffering. And of course, he himself at the head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, of which some people are critical.
Yes. Well, I think that at the very end, I had a conversation with a young man this afternoon who was from that school of criticism. And I said two things to him. One, that we don't want to be the judges of other people's lives, number one. First of all, it's not polite to be, demonizing a person's past. None of us are perfect. But somebody like Archbishop Tutu is somebody that is worth celebrating the world over. He's a human, mortal person who has had his own share of struggles and challenges. But in total, this is a man who was an absolutely superb human being on so many different levels, whether it's intellectual, political, social. He was a moral conscience of the nation, and he was not a hypocrite. And so my take on those, and it happens to everyone. When Madiba passed, there were those on social media attacking him. When my dad passed, it was the same thing. I think these men did the best that they can. And like an old woman said, you have done your good work on earth. It is time to return to the Lord to rest. So Archbishop Tutu is one of our superb heroes, and no amount of criticism will take his earned place in the pantheon of the ancestors.
Finally, I know the Achebe family would like to pass on their condolences, although I know it's already been done personally, but perhaps you'd like to share with the globe the message that for you as a family, as the Achebe family, that his memory lives on and his work and your fellowship.
Yes, thank you. So my family joins the world in expressing a profound sense of loss at Archbishop Desmond Tutu's passing. However, our feelings cannot be more intense than the bereavement of his immediate family and children, Umfo, Trevor, Teresa, and Naomi. May God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost grant them the fortitude to bear this loss, not just to them, but to all of us. I want to thank God for creating and sharing such a beautiful soul.
Thank you so much for speaking to us and sharing with us your thoughts, your experiences, and your sentiments, and condolences once again. That there is Dr. Chidi Achebe. He is the son of world-renowned literary giant, poet, writer, critic Chinua Achebe, and speaking to us about the experiences that they've had as a family, the friendship between the two men, Chinua Achebe and Archbishop Desmond Tutu.